The winter of 1878 came down on the Dakota prairie like a hammer. It was not a gentle descent into slumber, but a sudden, violent act of conquest. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hopeful blue only weeks before, turned to a slab of cold iron, pressing down on the endless grass. The wind was not a whisper, it was a blade, sharp and relentless, that found every crack in the hastily built sod houses and log cabins of the settlement they called Providence. It was a wind that carried no scent of pine or rain, only the sterile, biting odor of a world frozen solid. The cold did not knock before it entered. It simply seeped through the walls of mud and timber like a thief, stealing the heat from the hearths almost as quickly as it could be made. It stole the warmth from sleeping children, from the broth in the pot, from the very marrow of a man's bones. This was the central conflict of life in Providence. The fight against a cold so profound it felt like a living entity. The settlers were hardy people, drawn west by promises of land and a new start. They knew hardship. They had crossed mountains and forded rivers. But this cold was a different kind of adversary. It was patient, pervasive, and it defeated their conventional methods with silent, brutal efficiency. Their cabins, built from the same plans their fathers had used back east, were proving to be little more than wooden sieves. They chinked the logs with mud and grass. They stuffed rags into the window frames. They hung heavy blankets over the doors. But the cold still came. It crept across the floors in invisible currents, painted the inside of the walls with a delicate, deadly frost, and made the simple act of breathing a painful chore. The struggle was universal. In every dwelling that dotted the vast, snow-covered flatland, the same battle was being waged. Families huddled together around stoves that glowed a menacing red, devouring precious wood at an alarming rate. The woodpiles, which had seemed so monumental in the autumn, shrank with terrifying speed. Men who had prided themselves on their foresight and strength now looked at their dwindling fuel with a quiet, gnawing panic. They were following the old ways, the traditions of building and survival that had served generations. But the land was different here. The rules were different. The cold was a monster they had never met before, and it was winning. They adhered to flawed methods because those methods were all they knew, a catechism of survival passed down from a gentler climate. They built square, they built tall, and they froze. Among them lived a woman named Anya. She was a widow, her husband taken by a fever the previous spring, leaving her with two small children, a boy named Finn and a girl named Elin. She was seen as an object of pity, a quiet, solitary figure whose future in this harsh land seemed precarious at best. She was an outsider not by birth, but by circumstance and temperament. While others gathered to complain about the wind or the price of firewood, Anya watched. She observed the way the snow drifted against the north-facing walls of the cabins, forming immense, insulating banks. She watched the way the low winter sun, when it rarely appeared, struck the southern slope of the riverbank, melting the surface frost while the rest of the world remained locked in ice. Her husband, a man of books and diagrams, had been an engineer in the old country, a place of high mountains and deep winters. In the evenings, he had not told her stories of folklore, but had explained principles of thermodynamics, of thermal mass, and the patient, insulating power of the earth itself. He had left her not with money, but with knowledge. One day, as the first true snows of the next autumn began to fall, the men of the settlement were gathered near the half-finished cabin of a newcomer. They were offering advice, their voices loud and certain. "Build the walls thick," said one. "The fireplace must be massive," declared another, a man named Marcus, the settlement's most respected builder. It was then that Anya approached, her children holding tight to her skirt. She did not speak to the group. She walked to a clear patch of ground and, with a stick, began to draw a shape in the dirt. It was not a square. It was a long rectangle with a rounded back, designed to be set not upon the flat prairie, but dug directly into the south-facing riverbank. She sketched a cross-section, showing a deep stone foundation, thick earthen walls, and a roof that would be covered in living sod, flush with the prairie above. It was a home that was more a part of the land than a structure built upon it. Marcus stopped his pronouncements and walked over, a crowd of men following him. He looked down at the drawing, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then, in dawning disbelief, he let out a short, sharp laugh. "What is this, woman? A den for a badger?" The other men chuckled, the sound thin and sharp in the cold air. "You mean to live in a hole in the ground?" another asked, his tone a mixture of mockery and genuine astonishment. "It is a home," Anya said, her voice quiet but firm, not rising to meet their derision. "The earth will be the walls. The earth holds the warmth." Marcus shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "The earth holds damp, Anya. It holds the spring thaw. You will be flooded by May. Your children will catch their death from the chill of the mud. You are a widow, and you are grieving. But this is foolishness. Dangerous foolishness." He kicked dirt over her drawing, erasing the careful lines. "Build a proper cabin, like the rest of us. We will help you. Do not build your own grave." The men nodded in agreement, their skepticism a solid wall. They saw a dreamer, a foolish woman touched by grief, proposing an idea that defied all common sense, all tradition. They saw a hole. She saw a sanctuary. Despite their warnings and the quiet mockery that followed her through the settlement, Anya proceeded with her plan. She began to work alone. The first task was the excavation, a monumental effort of earth and will. She did not have the benefit of a team of oxen or strong men. She had a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a quiet, unyielding diligence. Day after day, from the thin light of dawn until the premature dusk, the lonely sound of her shovel scraping against soil and stone echoed from the riverbank. The work was slow and punishing. Her hands, unused to such labor, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calluses. Her back ached with a fire that never quite went out. But with every shovelful of earth she removed, she was not just digging a hole, she was carving out a space for survival, a bastion against the hammer of winter. Her children, too young to help with the heavy lifting, gathered smooth stones from the riverbed and stacked them in neat piles, their small contributions a testament to their shared purpose. While Anya toiled at her strange subterranean dwelling, the rest of Providence bustled with the familiar activities of winter preparation. Marcus and his crew finished the newcomer's cabin in a matter of weeks. The sound of their hammers was a sharp, confident rhythm against the vast silence of the prairie. They raised log walls, fitted a timber roof, and built a great stone chimney that rose proudly against the sky. They worked quickly, efficiently, their movements practiced and sure. They were building as they had always built. When they passed Anya's work site, they would sometimes pause and shake their heads. They saw her, covered in dirt, painstakingly laying a foundation of river rock and gravel for drainage, a step they all considered an unnecessary delay. They saw her wrestling with heavy retaining stones, and they saw a woman wasting her precious time and energy on a doomed project. Their cabins were finished, their wood was stacked high, and their families were inside, preparing for the coming cold in the traditional way, reinforcing the profound isolation of the woman digging her home out of the earth. Anya's method was a study in patience and precision, each detail a direct answer to the failures she had observed in the cabins around her. Her husband's lessons echoed in every decision she made. The foundation was not just a trench, but a deep bed of coarse gravel to ensure that any moisture in the ground would be drawn away from the living space. The walls were not just earth. They were a carefully engineered system. Against the excavated bank, she built a thick, freestanding wall of the largest stones she and her children could haul, leaving a crucial air gap between the stone and the raw earth. This gap, her husband had explained, was a barrier against the direct, chilling touch of the frozen ground. The interior walls were made of thick timber framing, packed with a mixture of dried prairie grass and clay, creating another layer of insulation. The roof was the most radical departure. Instead of thin shingles, she laid heavy timbers, covered them with a layer of oiled canvas for waterproofing, and then carefully replaced the thick sod she had first excavated. Her roof was a living part of the prairie, inches thick, a blanket of earth that would catch and hold the snow, turning winter's greatest weapon into a shield. The flue for her small, efficient stove was not a straight shot up, but was angled, running through a stone bench built against the back wall, a principle of thermal mass designed to capture the escaping heat and radiate it slowly back into the room long after the fire had died down. Every element was deliberate, a quiet argument against the flawed wisdom of her neighbors. The first sign of the great storm was not snow, but stillness. The wind, that constant, harassing voice of the prairie, fell silent. The air grew dense and heavy, and a strange, pearlescent light coated the sky. The temperature began to drop, not gradually, but as if a door to the Arctic had been flung wide open. Then the snow began, fine and dry, like a curtain of white sand being drawn across the world. For 3 days it fell, burying the prairie, burying the cabins, burying everything under a deep, silent blanket. When the snow stopped, the cold deepened. This was not the familiar winter of Providence. This was something else entirely, a primal cold that felt ancient and absolute. The settlers called it the white stillness. The sun was a pale, useless disk in the sky, offering no warmth. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a sharp pain in the lungs. Trees in the river gulch cracked with sounds like rifle shots. It was the ultimate test, a crisis sent to judge every decision, every piece of work, every belief about survival that the people of Providence held. Inside the traditional cabins, the world shrank to the small circle of warmth around the stove. The battle for heat became a desperate, losing fight. The frost that had once been a delicate lace on the walls now grew thick and furry, a creeping white mold that consumed the rooms from the corners inward. The drafts were no longer like knives, they were like lances, piercing through the chinking and finding every gap. Families burned through their wood at a terrifying pace. Men who had chopped and stacked for months saw their life's work turning to ash in a matter of days. The stoves, pushed to their limits, glowed cherry red, a constant danger of fire in the tinder-dry cabins. Yet they could not push the cold back more than a few feet. Children cried from the chill that seeped through their blankets. Water froze in buckets just steps from the hearth. Hope began to curdle into a cold, hard knot of fear. The walls of log and mud were failing. The old ways were failing. The community, which had been so confident, so sure in its methods, was being broken by the white stillness. In Anya's Riverbank home, the great storm was a distant rumor. The wind that screamed over the prairie above was only a muted, hollow hum inside her earthen walls. The crushing weight of the snow that had collapsed the roof of a poorly built shed in the settlement was, for her, just another layer of insulation, a thick, welcome blanket provided by the storm itself. Her small stove burned with a steady, gentle flame, consuming wood at less than half the rate of her neighbors. She did not need a roaring fire because the heat it produced was not immediately stolen by the cold. It was absorbed by the stone bench, by the thick earthen walls, by the very ground beneath her feet. The thermal mass her husband had spoken of was now a silent, powerful ally. It held the warmth and radiated it back, slowly, evenly, creating a consistent, comfortable temperature throughout the long, rectangular room. There was no frost on her walls. The air was cool but dry and still. Finn and Aylin played on a rug on the floor, their hands and faces not chapped with cold, their breath not misting in the air. Anya moved about her home with a calm, unhurried grace, mending a shirt, checking on a pot of stew. Her creation was being tested not by a battle, but by an embrace. The earth, her silent partner, was holding her and her children safe from the storm's rage. The contrast was absolute. In the settlement above, the interior temperature of Marcus's well-built cabin hovered just a few degrees above freezing, despite a fire that consumed a log every 20 minutes. 3 cords of wood, a supply he had believed would last until February, were nearly gone after only a week of the white stillness. His family lived in a single room, huddled in a tight knot of blankets, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The air was thick with smoke and the damp, miserable chill of impending defeat. 60 yards away, dug into the riverbank, the air inside Anya's home was a steady, comfortable 60 degrees. She had used less than half a cord of wood. Her children slept peacefully in their beds, warm under simple quilts. While Marcus and his neighbors were besieged, fighting a desperate, minute-by-minute war for survival, Anya and her children were simply living. The storm had drawn a line, separating one reality from another, a line between a shelter that fought the cold and a home that understood it. Marcus was the first to witness the success. His own woodpile was down to a few dozen logs, and a terrifying thought had taken root in his mind. The widow and her children, alone in their hole, were surely frozen. It was a thought born of guilt and a grim sense of responsibility. He had mocked her, warned her, and now he envisioned the worst. Bundled in every layer of clothing he owned, he fought his way through the deep, wind-carved drifts to the riverbank. He saw no smoke from a chimney, only a single stovepipe sticking out of a mound of snow, a thin, almost invisible wisp of heat rising from it. His heart sank. He had been right. It was a grave. He reached the heavy wooden door, set deep into the earth, and knocked, expecting no answer. When the door swung inward, he was struck not by a blast of frigid air, but by a gentle wave of warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a calm, steady warmth that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. Anya stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She simply held the door open for him. Marcus stumbled inside, his eyes struggling to adjust from the blinding white of the snow to the soft, lamplit interior. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw a small, quiet fire in the stove. He felt the warmth on his face, a feeling so profound and so welcome that he almost wept. He looked at the walls, expecting to see dampness or frost, but they were dry and clean. He looked at Anya, at her calm face, and the full weight of his arrogance, of his loud, certain, and utterly wrong pronouncements, crashed down upon him. He was the expert builder. He was the one everyone trusted, and he was wrong. She, the quiet widow he had pitied and scorned, had been right. She had not boasted. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply gestured to a wooden chair near the stone bench that radiated a gentle heat. "You are cold," she said, her voice even. "Sit. I will make tea." It was a simple act of hospitality, but for Marcus, it was an act of profound grace, a quiet triumph that shamed him more than any words ever could. The news of the widow's warm home traveled through the frozen settlement like a slow, thawing current. Marcus did not try to hide what he had found. He returned to his own frigid cabin and told his wife, his voice filled with a new, humbled awe. The next day, he led 2 other men, their faces wrapped in scarves against the biting wind, back to the riverbank. They too came expecting to offer help, perhaps to rescue the children from a foolish mother's folly. They too were met with the same shocking, undeniable reality. A calm, warm, and thriving home that seemed to exist in a different season from their own. They stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, touching the dry walls, feeling the radiant heat from the stone bench, their skepticism melting away in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The stories they brought back were not of a miracle, but of a method. The laughter that had once followed Anya was replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. A few days later, when a brief break in the cold allowed for movement between the cabins, Marcus returned to Anya's home. This time, he did not come out of concern or curiosity. He came as a student. He held a small, leather-bound notebook and a piece of charcoal. His pride, once as rigid and unyielding as the frozen ground, had been broken. He stood before her, a large, capable man made small by his own ignorance. "Teach me," he said. The words were quiet, a plea, not a demand. It was the moment the entire community's heart began to turn. Anya did not hesitate. She unrolled a set of her husband's old schematics, diagrams drawn with a precise engineering hand. She pointed to the cross-section of the wall, explaining the importance of the air gap and the gravel foundation for drainage. She explained the principle of thermal mass, how the stone and earth absorbed and stored heat like a battery. She showed him how the low angle of the winter sun streamed directly through her south-facing windows, providing passive heat during the day. She shared her knowledge freely, patiently, without a hint of condescension or a claim of superiority. She was not a victor sharing the spoils of her win. She was a survivor sharing the means of survival. She explained that the house did not fight the winter, it partnered with it. The deep snow on the roof was not a burden. It was the final, perfect layer of insulation. The frozen earth of the riverbank was not an enemy. It was a vast, stable shield that kept the wind out and the warmth in. Her home was not a fortress against nature, but a shelter in harmony with it. The men who had come to scoff now listened with rapt attention, their own hard-won experience being rewritten by the quiet logic of a woman they had dismissed. They asked questions. They took notes. They looked at the simple, elegant systems with the eyes of converts. They had spent their lives building boxes to trap fire, while Anya had built a vessel to hold warmth. The knowledge she shared was not a secret or a trick. It was a different way of seeing, a wisdom born from observation, study, and a humble respect for the overwhelming power of the natural world. When the white stillness finally broke and a long, slow spring began to thaw the prairie, the landscape of the settlement began to change. The sound of axes still rang out, but it was joined by the rhythmic scrape of shovels against earth. Following the sketches Marcus had copied from Anya's schematics, families began to build anew. They did not abandon their old cabins, but they retrofitted them, banking the north walls with thick layers of sod and dirt. The new homes, however, were built on Anya's principles. They were dug into hillsides and south-facing slopes, their profiles low and unobtrusive. The sight of new foundations being laid with deep gravel beds became common. The men learned to build with stone and earth, their carpentry skills now complemented by a deeper understanding of the land itself. The settlement of Providence, born from a tradition of square log cabins, was physically reshaping itself, its architecture now reflecting the hard-won lesson of that brutal winter. The story of the Riverbank home, as it came to be called, traveled beyond the confines of the valley. A surveyor, stranded in Providence for a week, saw the new style of building and took detailed notes. His professional curiosity piqued. He carried the tale and the principles to other fledgling settlements across the territory. Letters sent back east described not just the hardship of the prairie, but the ingenious solution that had been found. The tale was passed from one homesteader to another, a piece of practical folklore. It became a quiet movement, a slow-spreading idea that changed the way people survived in the North Country. Anya's design, born of her husband's knowledge and her own quiet determination, became a legacy, a gift to countless families she would never meet, all facing the same relentless cold. She never sought credit or fame. Her reward was the sight of smoke rising from the stovepipes of warm, safe homes and the sound of children playing without shivering. Years later, when the settlement of Providence had grown into a proper town, its buildings a unique mix of traditional cabins and earth-sheltered dwellings, visitors would often ask about the unusual architecture. The old-timers, Marcus among them, would point to the original home, still nestled peacefully in the riverbank, and tell the story of the great winter and the quiet widow who taught them all a lesson. The final moral was always the same. They learned that the most obvious solution is not always the wisest. They learned that pride is a poor insulator against the cold, and that tradition, when followed blindly, can become a trap. But the greatest lesson was the one Anya embodied, that true strength is not found in loud declarations or in resisting the forces of nature with brute force, but in quiet observation, in patient work, and in the humility to understand the world and find one's place within it, rather than in opposition to it. The harshest winter had not broken them. It had taught them how to truly live on the land, not just upon it.